Each of us has heard stories about witch hunts during the Middle Ages. Based on these stories, a huge number of films and TV shows have been shot. What if I told you that many of the facts you know about witches are nothing but fake? In this video, Top F will tell you 9 myths about witch hunts that you believe in thanks to movies and TV shows. Get your popcorn ready, we start. Myth number 1. Witch hunts took place in medieval Europe. When we hear the words witches and hunting, we imagine dirty, uneducated medieval Europe. These times, it would seem, are best suited for burning girls who look a little like witches. But in fact, the persecution began later. Until the 14th century, witchcraft was treated rather indifferently. It was considered a secular crime, writes Anita Obermeyer, a historian at the University of Bristol. Until the 15th century, the church did not even want to recognize the existence of witches and did not judge people for magic. And Pope Alexander IV 1258 officially forbade judging them by an ecclesiastical court. He declared that the servants of the Lord should destroy heretics and let the local authorities deal with all sorts of witches and fortune-tellers. It is logical, because heretics are a real threat, threatening a split in the flock. And some herbalists with conspiracies on male impotence and theft of milk are such a trifle that it is simply inconvenient to waste the time of the venerable Holy Fathers. The opinion of the government and the public about witches and sorcerers was not constant and changed depending on the time and place of the incident. So, in medieval England, they could be contacted for minor services, for example, to find a lost item, help with childbirth, or assist in love affairs. Many priests and theologians generally stated in their sermons that there are no witches, and that the very belief in witchcraft is a dangerous superstition that is unacceptable for decent Christians. The witch hunt began after the Renaissance and the discovery of the New World. Most of the executions of sorcerers took place already in modern times, from the 16th century, and they continued until the 18th century, writes British historian Hugh Trevor Roper. And the myth of the hunt for sorceresses in the Middle Ages appeared because of documents allegedly of those times, describing mass trials of witchcraft in Toulouse, France, from 1335 to 1350. They were based on the historian Joseph Hansen, who wrote 1901 a large-scale work on witch hunts. But in 1975, University of Sussex scientist Norman Cohn disproved Hansen's study. He discovered that the sources he referred turned out to be forgeries. Most likely, it was at the suggestion of Joseph Hansen that it became a tradition to erroneously link medieval Europe and the fight against witchcraft. Myth number 2. 9 million people died during the witch hunt. Another misconception about witch hunts has to do with the number of victims. On the internet, you can find different numbers, allegedly on suspicion of witchcraft. 9 or even 10 million women were burned alive. But these data are not true. Of course, religious hysteria in the 16th to 17th centuries and the destruction of innocent people is terrible, but there can be no talk of any millions of victims. Historian William Montert claims that about 35,000 people were killed, and Malcolm Gaskill, Richard Golden, and Michael Wolff say 40 to 50,000. Witch hunting is considered to be the apotheosis of savagery and barbarism, but wars, epidemics, religious persecutions, and the fight against heretics of the Renaissance and New Time claimed much more lives. The myth of the 9 million witches being burnt comes from a 1791 pamphlet owned by the German scholar Gottfried Christian Voigt. Describing the atrocities of the Catholic Church, he got a little carried away. Myth number 3. Only women were accused of witchcraft. The word witch is feminine, and in popular culture, It is generally accepted that in the past only ladies were sent to the stake for sorcery. This is explained by the fact that the church led the fight against witches, and Catholic priests were forced to observe a vow of celibacy and therefore indiscriminately showed misogynistic moods. However, there are nuances here, and in the 16th to 17th centuries, male sorcerers were also out of favor with the population. As historian Jeffrey Russell has calculated, men made up a quarter of those accused of witchcraft. In countries such as Estonia, Norway, and Iceland, they were more persecuted because they were believed to make stronger and more dangerous sorcerers. In Iceland, 92% of the defendants were men, and in Estonia 60%. And in Normandy, for example, the archetype of a shepherd sorcerer who sends misfortunes to his competitors is much more popular than the image of an old witch. Myth number 4. The legal way to figure out a witch is to drown her. Many people who are interested in history have heard about such a barbaric custom of witch hunters as testing by water. We take the suspect and send her to the icy river. If the sorceress is really in collusion with the devil, then water, as one of the sacred elements, will push her to the surface, refusing to accept the damned soul. And if the victim drowned, it means that he is innocent. We forgive and bury like good Christians. Horrific tales of testing by water can be found in many writings about witchcraft, but the prevalence of this method is somewhat exaggerated. First, in most places in Europe, water testing was simply illegal. Secondly, even where the drowning of suspects as a God's judgment was allowed, the judges did not sanction this action. They understood that a test that kills the defendant anyway looks a little silly. Third, even if drowning was allowed, the test subject, who demonstrated low buoyancy, was quickly pulled out by ropes prudently tied to his belt and found not guilty. The victim died during the test with water only when strangers decided to administer justice over her with their own hands. For example, in 1751 in Hertford, England, a certain Thomas Colley drowned 71-year-old Ruth Osborne, trying to prove her guilt in sorcery before the crowd. When the authorities found out about this, the jury sentenced Colley to hang for murder. Myth number 5. Witches have always been burned at the stake. Traditionally, the most appropriate execution for a witch is considered to be burning alive. However, in reality, it was far from necessary. The most common execution of sorcerers and witches was hanging. With the same Salem witches in America in the 17th century, they were dealt with in exactly this way. In Europe, beheading, especially honorary gentlemen, drowning and occasionally wheeling were added to this. It was burning alive that was practiced least of all of the above. As in the case of the water test, witches were sent to the stake only when the crowd, and not official bodies, took them to judge. And in English law, this type of execution was generally reserved exclusively for heretics and traitors to the state, and not for sorceresses. But the bodies of people executed for witchcraft were already burned, fearing that they would rise from the grave to take revenge on the executioners. From this custom, a stereotype arose. In addition, witches and witchers were subjected to other punishments, such as mutilation, branding, flogging, dipping in ice water, being locked in stocks, imprisonment, fines, exile, or selling into slavery. Myth number 6. Suspected witches were killed for their beauty. On the internet, you can find many statements that in Europe in the Middle Ages, all the most beautiful women were burned as witches. The fact that witch hunters especially burned beauties is a delusion. Most of the women tried for witchcraft were widows or loners over 50 years of age. University of Auckland historian Anna Garland explains this for many reasons. First, it is wrong to assume that witch hunters grabbed victims at the first denunciation. They blamed those against whom certain suspicions had already accumulated. And an old woman living far away from everyone would be looked at more cautiously than a young beauty. Secondly, such older people were more likely to show signs of antisocial or eccentric behavior because lonely old age is not conducive to mental health. Thirdly, people then believed that old people were more inclined to witchcraft as a means of revenge because they were no longer able to resort to physical force. Historians Jeffrey Scarr and John Callow argue that a typical portrait of a witch is an elderly wife or widow of a farm worker or small tenant farmer, known among the locals for her quarrelsome character and aggressiveness. Of course, this does not mean that all beautiful women could relax. Everyone became victims of accusations of witchcraft, rich and poor, old people and children, women and men, whoever falls under a hot hand. But to say that witch hunters purposefully exterminated beauties is wrong. Myth number 7. In Rus, witches were not hunted. Many believe that sorceresses were persecuted only in medieval Europe. This is not true. In Western countries, the persecution of witches began only with the Renaissance. Before that, magic was looked at rather indifferently. In Rus, for witchcraft, they were executed not with such enthusiasm and scale, but they did it for a long time because witches and witchers were considered pests that undermined the economy and agriculture. For example, in 1024, several people in Suzdal were killed for allegedly causing a drought. In Kiev in 1153, according to the testimony of the Arab merchant Abu Hamid al-Barnadi, who drove there, a group of elderly women were thrown into the water, and when they surfaced, they were burned for witchcraft. In 1227, 4 men were executed for witchcraft in Novgorod. They also staged a drought. In 1411, 11 women were burned at once in Pskov on the same charge. In Rus, however, witches were hunted less than warlocks. As historian Jeffrey Russell has calculated, up to 75% of the defendants were men. Their persecution continued on the territory of Rus and the Russian Empire and in modern times. Peter the Great, for example, not only opened a window to Europe, but also legally approved the execution of witchcraft in 1716. Empress Anna Ioannovna in 1731 declared that sorcerers were charlatans, but left the death penalty for them in her decree on the punishment for calling wizards and on the execution of such deceivers. Witches and witchers were to be burned, and their clients were to be whipped. And only Empress Catherine the Great abolished the death penalty for witchcraft in 1775, calling it a minor crime and superstition. Myth number 8. Those accused of witchcraft were obviously doomed. Many believe that if a person is already reported as a sorceress or a witcher, then he is finished. A confession will be forced out of the victim, and then, without leaving the cash register, they will be sent to execution. However, this is not quite true. In the Middle Ages, when the attitude towards magic was more tolerant than in modern times, the captured sorcerers and witches were not in a hurry to be dragged to the stake. Though there were times when they were sued by clients who demanded reimbursement when, surprisingly, the magic didn't work. The church limited itself to a few warnings and imposed penance. The witch apologized and was forgotten. And even after the Renaissance, amid the fight against witchcraft, the accused could well be acquitted. For example, according to the historian Gustav Henningsen, in 1609 in Spain, the Basque people, seized by religious hysteria, staged a massive witch hunt. But the defendant stood up for the one from whom this was least expected, Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias. He reviewed the evidence presented in the local secular courts, declared that there was and could not be any witchcraft, and ordered the release of all the accused. Historian Bang Ankerloo of Oxford describes how, between 1668 and 1676, a persecution of sorcerers broke out in Sweden, known as the Great Noise. The Royal Witchcraft Commission, formed in Stockholm by Charles XI, reviewed the cases and ordered all secular and ecclesiastical courts to cease persecution and drop any charges. However, His Majesty was 8 years late with the creation of the commission, and local authorities throughout the country managed to kill about 300 imaginary sorcerers and witches in a religious frenzy during this time. But in the end, justice prevailed, and the surviving suspects were forgiven. Better late than never, right? Myth number 9. All those accused of witchcraft worshipped a certain horned god. In 1921, anthropologist and expert on ancient Egypt Margaret Murray wrote the book The Witch Cult in Western Europe. In it, she outlined a rather plausible-sounding theory that all the sorceresses and sorcerers who were executed during the persecution in the 16th and 17th centuries were in fact members of some secret pagan cult. Murray suggested that all witches performed sexual games and strange rituals in honor of the pre-Christian Dionysus, or Janus, a god with 2 faces and horns, who has Roman roots. It was a kind of fertility ritual, with which members of the so-called covens tried to attract good luck in business and wealth. These witch organizations were allegedly so secretive, disciplined, and well-organized that the Catholic Church was unaware of their existence until the beginning of the Reformation. Murray very vividly depicted the sexual pleasures of witches, their worship of goats, curses, and covens. But in her work, she did not refer to any significant historical sources, but increasingly resorted to her own fantasies. Even contemporary historians caught Margaret on the contradictions in her book, and later critics did not leave a stone unturned on theories about the horned god. Nevertheless, it was thanks to the work of Margaret Murray that the modern neo-pagan religious movement called Wicca emerged. Its admirers worship the Mother Earth goddess and her husband, the horned god Pan, and consider themselves continuers of the traditions of witches and sorcerers of the 16th to 17th centuries. Although it is natural that the unfortunate, executed in that era on far-fetched accusations by obscurantist contemporaries, did not even know that they were apologists for an ancient religion that anticipated Christianity. Mr. Top F was with you. Bye. Thanks for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel and like this video if you haven't done it yet. Also, turn on notifications on our channel to catch all new videos.